What happens when a mother fights against the system that failed her daughter? A police officer's slap ignites a storm of corruption, hidden agendas, and dangerous secrets. As the truth emerges, can Lorraine and Maya survive the deadly forces that want them silenced? The reckoning has begun. Will justice prevail? Watch the story unfold. Are you ready for the truth? Maya Williams adjusted her backpack strap as she walked down the familiar street with her older brother Marcus. It was a typical Thursday afternoon in their quiet Atlanta neighborhood. The sun was starting to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Maya, her face bright with excitement, chatted away about her day at school. "I scored the highest on the math quiz today, Marcus," Maya said, her voice bubbling with pride. "That's awesome, little sis," Marcus replied with a smile, glancing at her. "But hey, remember, your brother's the one who helped you study, right?" She punched him lightly in the arm, giggling. "You didn't teach me that much. I was just on fire today." Their banter was interrupted by the sound of a car engine revving in the distance. Maya's heart skipped a beat. A police car. She always felt a knot in her stomach whenever she saw one, especially when it was this close. The officers in this area weren't exactly known for their kindness, and Maya had heard too many stories of things going wrong when people of color crossed their paths. "Maya, don't make eye contact," Marcus whispered, his voice low, but it was too late. As the police car slowed to a stop, the officers inside, Officer Harris and Officer Wilson, eyed them both. Harris's gaze lingered on Maya a moment longer than necessary. His eyes narrowed. Marcus instinctively stepped in front of his sister, trying to shield her from their view. "What are you kids doing here?" Officer Harris barked, his voice rough, almost threatening. His tone didn't leave room for a casual greeting. "Just walking home, sir," Marcus answered quickly, his voice calm but firm, trying to diffuse the tension. Harris's lips twisted into a sneer. "Walking home, huh? You know, it's not safe out here for kids like you." Maya's heart began to race. The words cut deeper than she had expected. She wanted to protest, to tell them they had no right to treat them this way, but something told her it was better to stay quiet. Marcus stood tall, his eyes on Harris, trying to keep his composure. "What do you mean, kids like you?" Marcus finally asked, his voice harder now. "Just do as I say, kid," Officer Wilson snapped from the passenger side, his hand resting on his baton as if to emphasize his authority. Maya's stomach turned. She knew this was not going to end well. She had seen how easily things could escalate. She glanced up at Marcus, her protective older brother, hoping he'd know how to handle this. "Everything's fine, officer," Marcus said, his tone strained but trying to remain respectful. "We're just going home." Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. He stood a little too close to Maya, his shadow looming over her, making her feel smaller than usual. Maya tried to shrink back but couldn't escape the intensity of his stare. "You," Harris said, pointing at Maya. "What's your name?" Maya's heart pounded as she met his gaze. She opened her mouth to speak but felt a sudden pressure in her chest. "Maya," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice. "Maya what?" Harris's voice was cold, laced with something sinister. "Maya Williams," she managed to say, looking down at her shoes, unable to keep his eyes in focus. Harris laughed, a short, mocking sound. "Williams, figures. Just another one of them." The words hit her like a slap, but it wasn't just the words. It was the way he said it. The disdain in his voice made her feel like she wasn't even human, like she didn't belong. "Maya, let's just go," Marcus said sharply, grabbing her hand. His grip tightened as they began to walk away, but before they could take another step, Harris's voice boomed, louder now. "Hold it right there!" Maya's blood ran cold. She stopped, her body frozen in place. Marcus turned around, his protective instinct kicking in. "Why are you stopping us?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking slightly but still trying to keep control. Harris's face twisted into a sneer. "You're walking away from me? After I asked you questions? Not a good idea." Before Maya or Marcus could react, Officer Harris stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab Maya's arm. "No!" Marcus shouted, stepping in front of his sister, putting himself between her and Harris, but it was too late. In one swift motion, Harris pulled Maya toward him, his grip firm and unrelenting. "Let go of her!" Marcus yelled, shoving Harris back with all his strength. Maya screamed, the sudden force making her dizzy. The pain in her arm was sharp, and before she could fully understand what was happening, Officer Harris raised his hand and struck her across the face. The world seemed to stop. Maya's vision blurred as she stumbled back, her cheek burning from the impact. She couldn't understand. Why? Why had he done this? Tears stung her eyes and her heart raced, but Marcus was already there, his arms around her, pulling her away. "Come on, Maya, we're leaving," he said, his voice shaking. But Harris's laugh echoed behind them. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think that's how it works in my city?" Harris sneered. Maya didn't look back. She couldn't. The world felt heavy, too heavy to carry. Her face throbbed, and she could hear Marcus's steady breathing beside her. But the fear in his voice made her heart ache more than the slap. Mr. Jenkins sat by his window, sipping his afternoon coffee, when he first heard the raised voices outside. He had seen plenty in his lifetime, too much to let a few loud words bother him, but this was different. The voices sounded desperate, and the words they were exchanging carried a harshness that sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced out the window, his old eyes squinting through the glass. Two police officers were standing next to two kids. The younger one, a girl, looked scared. The older one, a boy, had his fists clenched. Mr. Jenkins' heart sank when he recognized them. It was Maya and Marcus Williams, the children from the neighborhood. The scene was escalating fast. He watched as the Officer Harris, grabbed Maya by the arm, pulling her toward him roughly. The boy, Marcus, was doing his best to protect her, but the situation was clearly out of his control. Then it happened. Officer Harris slapped Maya. Mr. Jenkins' hand trembled as he set his coffee cup down on the windowsill. He knew better than to get involved. But this was different. Maya didn't deserve this. None of them did. His fingers hovered over the phone, then hesitated. He wasn't a young man anymore. He hadn't been involved in anything like this in years. But something inside him snapped, something he thought was long gone. That spark of justice, of right and wrong. He couldn't let it go unnoticed. He had to do something. Quickly, he picked up his phone and started recording the scene. Through the lens of his camera, he watched as the officers continued to berate the kids, their voices harsh and filled with contempt. He saw Maya's small form flinch each time Harris spoke. Her fear was palpable, but there was something else too, a hint of defiance buried deep within her, even if she couldn't yet express it. It wasn't just about the slap, it was about something bigger, something she didn't yet understand but would soon enough. Mr. Jenkins kept the camera steady. He didn't dare let his hand shake. Every second counted. "I told you to stay put," Officer Harris sneered at Marcus, who was still trying to shield his sister from the officers. "You think you can just walk away from me?" "No, sir," Marcus replied, his voice tight with restraint. "We're just trying to go home." "You're lucky I'm even letting you go," Harris spat, tightening his grip on Maya's arm. "Next time, you'll think twice before stepping out of line." Mr. Jenkins could hear the tremor in Marcus's voice, the desperation. He could see it in Maya's wide eyes, in the way she stood there, frozen, fighting back tears. His fingers hovered over the phone for a moment longer before he took the next step. He had to make sure this was seen by the right people. The last thing he wanted was for his recording to be ignored, to disappear into the void like so many others. But today, something felt different. This was the kind of thing that had to be known. He kept the camera running for a few more minutes. By the time the officers finally let Maya and Marcus go, they were visibly shaken. Marcus helped Maya regain her balance, his hands gently guiding her forward. She was smaller than him, and yet, in that moment, she seemed to carry the weight of something far larger than her. As they walked away, Mr. Jenkins lowered the phone, his mind racing. What had he just witnessed? What were those officers really doing out there? He had been around long enough to know when things didn't add up. The power dynamic was clear. The kids, in his mind, were always going to be the ones caught in the system. The police, no matter how well-meaning some might be, were part of something that wasn't always fair. And it wasn't just about Maya and Marcus anymore. This was about everyone who had ever felt the sting of being treated like they didn't belong. Mr. Jenkins stood up from his seat and walked over to the door. He needed to make sure the footage got into the right hands. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He had seen too much injustice in his lifetime to sit by silently. He reached for his jacket, his hand steady now, and pulled open the door. The wind greeted him as he stepped outside. His heart was pounding, but he felt alive, like he hadn't in years. As he walked toward the corner of the block, the phone in his hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The truth was out there now, and it was going to be harder to ignore. The news hit like a storm. Within hours of the video being uploaded, the world began to shift. What had been a quiet, uneventful day in the Williams household now felt like the calm before a chaotic storm. Lorraine, Maya's mother, had been preparing dinner when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the urgency in the voice on the other end told her everything she needed to know. "Tam fan Lorraine Johnson?" the voice asked. "I'm calling about the incident with your daughter. It's all over the news." Lorraine's stomach twisted. She hadn't seen the video, but she knew what it was. Maya had been slapped by Officer Harris, the officer she had encountered too many times. The officer who'd never given her family the benefit of the doubt. "I'll be right there," Lorraine said, her voice steady despite the panic flooding her chest. When she arrived at the local news station, she could already see the coverage on the screen in the lobby. Maya's small face, tear-streaked but strong, flashed across the screen. The video had gone viral, and it was no longer just a local issue. This was bigger now. Lorraine's mind raced. What had started as a simple confrontation had now become a battle of public opinion. The situation was no longer just about getting Maya justice. It was about protecting her family from a tidal wave that was gaining momentum with every second. Maya sat in her room, staring at the glowing screen of her phone. She couldn't look away. Her face, her voice, her pain, broadcasted for everyone to see. What was once a private moment, a horrifying experience she had hoped would stay in the past, was now on display for the world. The comments, the messages, the accusations, everything was too much for her to handle. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the endless stream of people sharing their opinions. Some were kind, offering words of encouragement, but most were harsh, accusing her of everything from provoking the officers to making up the whole thing. "What did I do wrong?" Maya whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the loud noise in her head. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but she couldn't. The weight of everything was too heavy. She had never felt so exposed in her life. At that moment, Marcus knocked gently on her door, his voice soft. "Maya, you okay in there?" She didn't answer at first, but then she heard his footsteps approaching. She sat up, wiping away the tears that had started to fall without her realizing it. He walked in, closing the door behind him. "They're talking about us, Marcus. They're all talking about me," Maya said, her voice breaking. Marcus sat beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "I know. I saw. But you're strong, Maya. You have to remember that. This is just the beginning, but we're going to get through it." Maya looked at him, her big brown eyes filled with fear. "But what if they don't believe us? What if they just forget?" "They won't forget. They can't," Marcus replied, his voice firm but filled with a quiet intensity. "You're not alone in this. I'll be with you every step of the way." Back at the news station, Lorraine sat in front of the cameras, doing her best to maintain composure as the reporters asked her questions. They wanted answers. They wanted action. They needed something to feed the story, something that would satisfy the audience who were now demanding justice. "Tam Fan Johnson," a reporter asked, "what do you say to people who claim that this incident was blown out of proportion?" Lorraine's jaw tightened. She was trying to keep her emotions in check, but the question hit too close to home. She cleared her throat before responding. "What I'll say is this. My daughter was assaulted. The video speaks for itself. Maya didn't deserve what happened to her, and no child, no matter their race, should have to live in fear of being treated that way." The room was silent for a moment as Lorraine's words hung in the air. She knew she had to stand firm. She had to be the voice that spoke up when everyone else was either silent or too afraid to speak the truth. "Is this about police brutality?" a different reporter asked. Lorraine nodded slowly. "Yes, it's about police brutality. It's about racial injustice. And it's about the system failing my daughter, and I will not let it continue." The fallout was just beginning. As the news spread, so did the opinions. Maya and Marcus had no idea what was coming next. Their lives, their family, were about to be tested in ways they couldn't have imagined. Maya's phone buzzed again, this time with a text message from her best friend. "Are you okay? I can't believe what happened. I'm so sorry." Maya bit her lip as she typed out a quick response, her fingers shaking. "I'm fine, just scared." She stared at the words for a long moment before pressing send. What else was there to say? Marcus knocked on her door again, this time with a sense of urgency. "Mom wants us downstairs. The lawyers are here." Maya's heart sank. She wasn't ready for this. The meeting, the lawyers, the paperwork, everything felt too big, too overwhelming. But as she stood up, she saw the look on Marcus's face. He was trying to be strong for her, but she could see the worry in his eyes. As they made their way downstairs, Maya's mind raced. What did it mean to stand up for what was right? What if it cost them everything? But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back. She couldn't unsee what had happened to her, and whatever came next, she would face it head on. Lorraine's hands trembled as she clicked the door open, stepping into the small, sterile conference room. The smell of coffee and stale air lingered in the corners, and the flickering fluorescent lights above did little to ease the tension in her chest. The table was cluttered with paperwork and empty mugs, but the people seated around it, their eyes on her as she entered, were the true source of discomfort. Two lawyers, both stern-looking men in their mid-40s, sat on one side. Their faces were rigid, expressions carefully neutral, as if they had long learned not to show emotion in front of their clients. Across from them, an investigator from the police department, Detective Mark Adams, sat with his arms crossed, his demeanor guarded, his eyes sharp. Next to him was a reporter, Claire James, a local journalist who had been following Maya's story from the start. She was taking notes quietly, as if every word spoken here was ammunition for a battle that hadn't yet begun. Lorraine sat down slowly, trying to steady her nerves. The room was still, but the air was thick with unspoken words. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, as if they were waiting for her to speak first. "Tam Fan Lorraine Johnson," the investigator said finally, his voice low and measured. "We've seen the video, and we've been informed of the situation regarding your daughter, but you need to understand this is a bigger issue than what happened on the street." Lorraine raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that?" "We've been looking into Officer Harris and Officer Wilson," Detective Adams continued, his voice calm, but his eyes flicking toward the lawyer's side of the table. "And I'm afraid there are things you don't know, things that extend beyond the incident with your daughter." Lorraine's stomach sank. She wasn't sure what he was implying, but the coldness in his tone didn't offer any comfort. "What are you saying?" Claire James, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. "You need to understand, Lorraine, that this isn't just about a bad cop or a bad moment. There are deeper systemic issues at play here, and they go all the way up. We've been doing some digging, and what we're finding, it's not just Harris. It's a network, a web of corruption within the force." Lorraine blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "A network?" "Exactly," Claire replied, nodding. "The officers involved in this incident, they're not isolated. They're part of a much larger group, a group that's been manipulating investigations, covering up crimes, and even working with external criminals to control the streets." The words hit Lorraine like a punch to the gut. She couldn't speak for a moment, the weight of it pressing on her chest. It felt like the floor was shifting beneath her feet. She had thought this would be about justice for her daughter, but now it was so much bigger. "I need to know what you're talking about," Lorraine said, her voice shaking but firm. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not now, not when everything was on the line. Detective Adams leaned forward, his eyes now fixed on her. "I'm telling you, Tam Fan, that Harris and Wilson are part of a corrupt system that's been using their positions to make deals with criminals. They've been involved in money laundering, drug trafficking, and even pushing false charges to cover up their own illegal activities. We have evidence, documents, recordings, but it's going to take time to piece it all together." Lorraine felt her blood run cold. She had known Harris was bad. She had known he had a history with her, a personal grudge that had played into his treatment of Maya. But this was something she hadn't prepared for. "How do we bring this to light?" Lorraine asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though every ounce of her was fighting to stay composed. "The investigation has already begun," Detective Adams said, his tone more somber now. "But the problem is the corruption goes all the way up the chain of command. We're not just dealing with rogue cops, we're dealing with a broken system. We can't go public with everything just yet. If we do, it will destroy everything we're working on." The weight of his words hit Lorraine like a freight train. She hadn't known what to expect when she walked into this room, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. "We need your help, Lorraine," Claire James said, her voice soft but urgent. "We need your voice. The public has been rallying behind Maya, but we can't do this without you. You're the key. You're the one who can get people to listen." Lorraine felt a cold chill run through her as she turned toward the journalist. "What do you want me to do? You want me to expose the corruption in the police force? Do you understand what that will cost me? My family? Maya?" "We're not asking you to throw your family under the bus," Claire replied quickly, her voice sincere. "But if we don't act now, we might lose everything. You've been in the system long enough to know what's at stake. We can't wait." For the first time in her life, Lorraine felt trapped. Her entire career had been built on justice, on truth. And now the very system she had sworn to uphold was the thing standing in her way. It wasn't just about the police anymore. It was about the entire system, about the invisible powers that controlled everything. "We're in this together," Claire continued. "If you stay silent, this will just become another forgotten story. But if you speak up, if you demand change, this can be the moment that starts something bigger than any of us." Lorraine's hands were shaking as she reached for the papers on the table, her mind racing. She couldn't back down now. Not when she had seen what was at stake, not when Maya had suffered. "All right," Lorraine said, her voice steadying. "Let's do this. For Maya, for the people who've been hurt by this system, let's bring them down." The room seemed to exhale collectively, though Lorraine could still feel the weight of what they were about to do. But as she looked at the team assembled around her, she felt a spark of determination. This wasn't just about one girl or one family. This was about making sure no one else would ever have to go through what Maya had. The news came like a blow to the gut. Lorraine hadn't expected to feel it so sharply. It wasn't the kind of news she was prepared for. She sat in the car, the phone in her hand, her fingers numb from gripping it too tightly. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but distant. "Tam Fan," the voice said, "I don't know how to say this, but we have reason to believe that someone close to you has been leaking information to the opposition." Lorraine's heart skipped a beat. "What? Who?" "I can't say just yet, but it's bad. We believe it's someone inside your legal team." The world tilted, and Lorraine's head spun. The one person she had trusted, the one person who knew the case inside out, had betrayed them. The weight of it crushed her chest. "This can't be happening," Lorraine muttered under her breath, trying to steady her breath. "Who would do this?" "Let me dig into it, Tam Fan. We'll find out soon." Lorraine ended the call, her mind racing. The thought of betrayal was something she never expected from those closest to her. Trust had always been the foundation of everything she had worked for. But now it felt like everything she had built, everything she had fought for, was crumbling in front of her. Later that day, Lorraine stood in front of her office, her eyes scanning the room where the legal team had gathered. The case was on the edge of collapse, the pressure mounting. She had to make sure everyone on her team was still loyal, but her instincts screamed that something was off. She turned to her lead attorney, John Mitchell. He had been with her for years, their bond built on years of trust and shared battles. But now, as she stood there, his expression seemed different, closed off, guarded. "John," Lorraine began, her voice tight, "we need to talk." John looked up, his face betraying no emotion. "Of course, Tam Fan. What's on your mind?" "I need to know if I can trust you. I need to know if you're still with me on this." John blinked, then nodded slowly. "You've always been able to trust me." But Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. The way he spoke, the hesitation in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. Her gut twisted. She couldn't afford to be wrong. If someone on her team was working against her, the entire case could be compromised. "I hope so," Lorraine whispered, more to herself than to John. Later that evening, Lorraine sat alone at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she sifted through the case files. The betrayal she had been warned about hung over her like a dark cloud, clouding her thoughts. The weight of everything was crushing her, making it hard to focus. She had to push through, for Maya, for her family, for the people who were counting on her. The doorbell rang, cutting through the silence. Lorraine rose to her feet, unsure of what to expect. She opened the door to find Marcus standing there, his face drawn, his expression tired. "I thought we should talk," Marcus said quietly. "Of course, come in," Lorraine replied, her voice strained. Marcus stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He hesitated before sitting down at the kitchen table, his eyes searching her face for signs of worry. "Mom," he began, "I know you're under a lot of pressure, but something doesn't feel right." "What do you mean?" Lorraine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's the case. I've been talking to some people, and I think someone is trying to sabotage it. Not just the police, but someone on the inside. Someone in your team." Lorraine's heart skipped a beat. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" "I overheard a conversation at the courthouse," Marcus continued, his voice low. "I'm not sure who, but I'm pretty sure someone's been talking to the opposition. I don't know if they're doing it for money or just to protect themselves, but they're not loyal." Lorraine's mind reeled. Was Marcus right? Could it really be true? Had someone, been the one leaking the information? She didn't want to believe it, but the signs were becoming too obvious to ignore. "Are you sure?" Lorraine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded. I overheard enough to know something's wrong. I didn't want to say anything before, but now it feels like we're running out of time. We need to figure out who's behind it before it's too late. Lorraine looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just a case about justice anymore. This was about survival, about protecting her family, and about making sure Maya's story didn't get buried by corruption. I'll look into it, Lorraine said, determination settling into her chest. We can't let them win. Not like this. Marcus stood up, a sense of urgency in his movements. I'm with you, Mom, whatever it takes. The betrayal had been unveiled, but the battle was far from over. Now, Lorraine had to find out who was behind it and make sure that they paid for what they had done. She couldn't afford to make another mistake, not when everything was at stake. As Lorraine sat back down at the table, her mind was already racing ahead. The case, the betrayal, it was all coming to a head, and now she had no choice but to fight back. For Maya, for Marcus, and for the countless others who had been victims of the same broken system. But as Lorraine looked at the empty chair across from her, she knew one thing: the war was just beginning. And in this fight, there could be no more room for loyalty to the wrong people. Lorraine sat at her desk, staring at the documents spread out in front of her. The case was becoming more complex by the hour, and the pressure was beginning to weigh heavily on her shoulders. Every time she thought they were getting closer to the truth, another layer of deception was revealed. Now, she had something she couldn't ignore, a whisper of a hidden network within the police force. The evidence was scant, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. The investigation had started with Officer Harris and Officer Wilson, two men who had been directly involved in Maya's assault. But now, as the pieces began to fall into place, Lorraine realized it was much bigger. She had been fighting against a system, not just a few bad cops. What she had once thought were isolated incidents were now clearly connected, part of a larger, darker pattern. A web of corruption that reached far beyond the officers involved in her daughter's case. As she sifted through the files, Lorraine's mind replayed the conversation she had had with Detective Adams just days before. He had spoken about the network of corrupt officers, but it hadn't fully hit her until now. The true scope of it was overwhelming. She had always known that the system was flawed, but this was something entirely different. This was organized corruption, a systemic abuse of power, and Maya's case was just a small part of it. Lorraine's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up quickly, hoping for a break in the case. It's Claire, Lorraine muttered to herself, recognizing the number on the screen. This better be good, she answered the call. Claire, what do you have? I've got something, Claire's voice crackled through the line, low and urgent. It's bigger than we thought. We've traced the connections. Harris and Wilson, along with a few others, aren't just on their own. They're part of a larger group within the department. Lorraine's pulse quickened. She leaned forward in her chair, the weight of Claire's words sinking in. What do you mean? I mean that they've been working with outside parties, drug cartels, money laundering, the whole damn thing, and it's all covered up by the department. The air in Lorraine's lungs seemed to leave her in a rush. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the enormity of what Claire was telling her. How deep does it go? Lorraine whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. Too deep. We've only scratched the surface, but it's worse than we could have imagined. The officers involved, Harris, Wilson, and some others, have been protecting organized crime in exchange for favors. They've been doing this for years, and they're not alone. The higher-ups are in on it too. The people who should be investigating this, they're part of it, Lorraine. Lorraine's hands shook as she put the phone down, her thoughts racing. Everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in, was now under siege. This wasn't just a case of police misconduct. It was a full-blown criminal enterprise operating within the very system that was supposed to protect the public. But what could she do? She couldn't fight this alone. If what Claire was saying was true, the entire system was compromised, and exposing it would require more than just courtroom arguments. It would take more than she could do on her own. But she wasn't alone. She had her family, her team, and the community that was starting to rally behind Maya's story. This wasn't just about seeking justice anymore. It was about survival. Lorraine took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had to keep moving forward. For Maya, for Marcus, for everyone who had been wronged by the very system meant to protect them. The next day, Lorraine called a meeting with her legal team. Everyone had gathered at her office: John Mitchell, her trusted lawyer, Claire James, the journalist who had been digging into the police corruption, and Detective Adams, who had been working quietly behind the scenes to uncover the officers involved. "We're in deeper than we thought," Lorraine began, her voice sharp, cutting through the tense silence in the room. "What Claire has uncovered is just the tip of the iceberg. The officers involved in Maya's case, Harris and Wilson, they're part of a much larger network, a criminal syndicate that's been using their positions to protect and profit from criminal activity." The room went still, and Lorraine could see the shock in their eyes. John Mitchell was the first to speak. "Are you saying the entire police force is involved?" he asked, his voice low and disbelieving. "Not the whole force, but too many to ignore," Lorraine replied. "And what's worse, the higher-ups are complicit in covering it all up. We've got internal investigations that are being blocked, and people who should be investigating this are actively protecting the criminals within their ranks." Detective Adams leaned forward, his face tense. "We've been working on this quietly for months, but we're not getting the cooperation we need. The truth is, Lorraine, it's going to take more than legal action to break this. We're up against a system that's rotted from the inside." Claire, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "But we can't let that stop us. The public is already on Maya's side. The media is starting to pick up on the connections. If we expose this network, we can tear it apart piece by piece. But we have to act fast. If we wait too long, they'll cover their tracks even more." Lorraine's mind raced. She knew Claire was right. If they didn't act quickly, this could all slip away. But even as she made her decision, something in the back of her mind warned her that the battle was going to get even dirtier. The forces they were up against weren't just corrupt, they were powerful. "We go public," Lorraine said, her voice steady and resolute. "We take this to the media. We can't let them silence us anymore. This is bigger than Maya. It's bigger than me. It's about exposing a broken system." The team exchanged uncertain glances, but Lorraine's determination was unwavering. The hidden network was now their focus, and they would stop at nothing to tear it down. As Lorraine stood at the head of the table, looking at the team she had gathered, she knew that the hardest part was just beginning. They were about to face a fight unlike anything they had ever known, but with each passing moment, the hidden network was starting to unravel, and Lorraine could feel the tide beginning to turn. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting to change the system, and this time, they were going to win. The first protest was small. Just a handful of people gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs demanding justice for Maya. But it quickly grew, swelling into a crowd of hundreds, then thousands. News outlets from across the city and beyond arrived to cover the event, their cameras capturing the faces of people who had grown tired of being silenced, tired of being ignored. The public was waking up, and they were angry. Maya sat in the back of Lorraine's car, staring out the window as the protesters marched through the streets. Their chants, loud and unified, echoed in her ears, but she barely heard them. All she could think about was the day it all started, the moment Officer Harris's hand slapped her face, the moment her innocence was shattered. It felt like that moment was happening all over again, the pain of it still fresh in her mind. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What if this protest was just the beginning? What if it didn't stop here? "Maya, are you okay?" Lorraine asked, her voice soft yet full of concern. Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned to face her mother. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said, her voice barely audible. "What if they don't believe us? What if they just forget? What if—" "Maya," Lorraine interrupted gently, "they won't forget, and they won't stop fighting for you. Look at them." She gestured toward the crowd. "This isn't just about one person anymore. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what you went through. And we're not doing this alone. We have an army now." The words resonated in Maya's chest, but she still felt a chill of doubt. The world had been watching her since the video of the incident went viral. The voices of the people demanding justice were growing louder, but so was the opposition. Powerful people, those who had been part of the corrupt system for so long, weren't going to give up without a fight. And as the protests continued to grow, so did the pressure on her family. Inside the courthouse, the legal team was preparing for the next phase of the case. The world's attention was squarely on Maya and her fight for justice, and the stakes had never been higher. Lorraine, John, Claire, and Detective Adams sat together, poring over the evidence that had been collected over the past few weeks. It was clear that they were getting closer to breaking the case wide open. But there were whispers now. Whispers that the officers involved were being protected by people much more powerful than anyone had anticipated. We have to be careful, John said, his voice low as he leaned over the table. We're dealing with a system that's entrenched in corruption. People are scared. If we push too hard, they'll find a way to shut us down. Not if we have the people on our side, Lorraine replied, her eyes steely with determination. This is bigger than just us. The public is already awake. They won't let them silence us anymore. Claire nodded in agreement. The protest is just the beginning. We're going to need the media on our side. We need to keep the pressure up every single day. If we let up for even a second, they'll bury this. Detective Adams, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. We're going to need more than just public support. We need hard evidence. We need people on the inside willing to testify. And we need to be ready for the backlash. The next morning, the courthouse steps were filled with more people than Maya had ever seen in her life. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, with signs that read, "Justice for Maya," "End police brutality," and "We stand with you." The air was thick with anticipation. Maya stood at the center of the group, her heart racing as she scanned the faces of those who had come to support her. She couldn't believe how many people were there for her, there to demand justice not just for her, but for everyone who had been wronged by a broken system. But as the rally grew larger, so did the threats. Lorraine had been warned. The phone calls, the anonymous letters, all of it pointed to one thing. They were getting too close to the truth, and those in power would do whatever it took to stop them. The first sign came in the form of an anonymous email sent to the legal team. It was simple, but its message was clear. Stop, or we'll make sure your lives are ruined. You can't take down the system. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. They were too far in, and too many people were depending on them to back down. Maya took a deep breath as she stepped forward, her mother beside her. She could feel the weight of the crowd's expectations on her shoulders, but she knew this was her moment. This was their moment. Today, Maya said, her voice shaking but gaining strength as she spoke, is the day we fight for everyone who has ever been silenced. We're not backing down. We're not going away. The crowd erupted into cheers, and for the first time since the slap, Maya felt something inside her shift. The fear, the doubt. It was still there, but it was being drowned out by something stronger. Hope, determination, a burning desire for change. As the crowd continued to chant and march, Lorraine stood quietly to the side, watching her daughter take her place in history. She could see the strength in Maya now, the courage that had been there all along, buried beneath the pain. Lorraine knew they were facing an uphill battle. The fight for justice would not be easy. There would be more setbacks, more threats, more obstacles standing in their way. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The reckoning had begun, and it would not be stopped. The phone call came in the middle of the night. Lorraine had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The rally, the protests, the pressure, it was all consuming. But she hadn't expected this. Not yet. The number on her phone was unrecognized, but she answered anyway, her pulse quickening as the words came through. "Tam Fan Johnson, we've got a problem," said Detective Adams, his voice strained. "I just got off the phone with someone inside. There's been a leak. They're moving faster than we thought." "What do you mean? What's happened?" Lorraine's voice was sharp, almost frantic, the dread creeping in. "They're trying to shut it all down. They know we're closing in. Someone tipped them off. Someone inside the department. We've got a warrant to go after Harrison Wilson, but someone's already made sure the evidence is gone. It's gone cold, and they're going to bury it." Lorraine's heart dropped into her stomach. She could feel the walls closing in, the very system she had trusted turning against her. The shockwave from this news reverberated through her like a punch to the gut. "No," Lorraine said, her voice low but filled with cold resolve. "We can't let them win." "I know," Adam said, a flicker of urgency in his voice. "But we need backup. We need to move fast before they make their next move." Lorraine didn't hesitate. "Get your team. I'll call the media." She ended the call and sat in the dark for a moment, her mind racing. She had always known the fight would be tough, but this was a game changer. Whoever had warned the officers, whoever was working against them, had more power than she realized. But there was no going back now. She grabbed her phone and made the call to Claire James, who answered almost immediately. "Lorraine, what's going on?" Claire's voice was sharp with concern. "We've been compromised," Lorraine said, not wasting time on pleasantries. "Someone tipped off the cops. The evidence against Harrison Wilson is gone. We need to go public, and we need to do it now." "I'm on it," Claire said without hesitation. The media's been buzzing all day about the protests, but this will break the silence. We need to get the story out, Lorraine. People need to hear the truth. Lorraine nodded, though Claire couldn't see it. She wasn't sure how much longer they had before the full weight of the backlash came down on them. But one thing was certain, they had to act. They couldn't let the system bury this. The next morning, the world erupted. The press conference that Lorraine had arranged was supposed to be a calculated move, controlled, with facts laid out clearly for the public. But as she stood in front of the cameras, the weight of everything pressed against her chest. The reporters were already screaming questions, their voices rising in volume as they surrounded her. What's happening with the police officers involved in your daughter's case? Do you have proof of this alleged corruption? Do you think the police department is actively covering up the crime? Lorraine's mind swirled as she gathered her thoughts. She had to make them listen. She had to get the truth out, no matter the cost. We are not backing down, she said, her voice steady and powerful. What happened to my daughter is not an isolated incident. This is about a system that has allowed corruption to thrive. We have evidence, documented proof, that the officers involved in this case are part of a much larger network, a network that is complicit in shielding criminals. This is not just about one bad cop. It's about a broken system. The cameras clicked furiously, and Lorraine felt the eyes of the world on her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She couldn't afford to be. If we do not act now, if we do not expose this, we will be letting it continue. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every single person who has been hurt by a corrupt system, and we will fight until it is brought to light. The reporters bombarded her with more questions, but Lorraine stood tall, unwavering. She could feel the shockwave of her words reverberating through the crowd. The moment she had feared, being thrust into the center of the storm, had come, but she wouldn't let it tear her apart. Back at the courthouse, the shockwaves were already rippling through the city. The rally that had begun as a small protest was now a national movement. The crowd outside the courthouse was massive, bigger than anyone had anticipated. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds stood in solidarity, chanting for justice. The signs they held high were more than just words. They were demands for change. The momentum had shifted, and now the voices of the people were louder than ever. Inside, Lorraine and her team worked tirelessly to prepare for what would come next. John Mitchell was on the phone, trying to secure the next steps for the case. Claire was coordinating with journalists, making sure the story was being picked up across the nation. Detective Adams was in the field, making sure their next move was timed perfectly. But Lorraine couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something bigger was coming, something they weren't ready for. As she walked into her office, she found a thick envelope waiting for her on the desk. Her name was scrawled across the front in bold, angry letters. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she read the contents. It was a letter. No, a threat. We warned you to stop. Now it's too late. If you continue, we will make sure you lose everything. You're no longer safe. Lorraine's heart pounded as she set the letter down. This was bigger than just her family. They had made it personal. Whoever was behind this, whoever had orchestrated the corruption, wasn't going to stop until they had destroyed everything she held dear. But that only made Lorraine more determined. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated the power of the people behind her. The reckoning had begun. Lorraine stood alone in her office, the weight of the last few days crashing down on her. The phone calls, the threats, the endless questions from the media. It had all been building to this moment. The world was watching, and the pressure was more than she could have ever imagined. But there was something else too, something that no one had prepared her for, the crushing sense of vulnerability. Her family, her daughter, were no longer just victims in a story. They were pawns in a game played by forces far more powerful than anything she had ever encountered. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just a fight for Maya anymore. It wasn't even about justice anymore. This was about survival. Her phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through the silence. She grabbed it quickly, hoping for something, anything, that might give her a lead. "Tam Fan Johnson," the voice on the other end said, urgent and clipped. "You need to get down here, now. It's happening. We've got a witness, and he's ready to talk." The words hit Lorraine like a splash of cold water. A witness. After all this time, after all the digging, they finally had someone who could bring everything into the light. "Who?" she asked, her voice tight. Detective Morris. He's a former officer with the department, worked alongside Harris and Wilson. He's been on the inside for years, and he has information on the network, but he won't talk unless you're there. He trusts you. Lorraine's pulse quickened, a chance to break the case wide open. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The room was dim, and Lorraine could feel the tension thick in the air as she entered the small interrogation room. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor echoed in her ears as she took her seat across from Detective Morris. His face was drawn, his eyes haunted by years of secrets he had been forced to keep. "You've been inside it all this time," Lorraine said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You know what's going on. You know who's behind it." Morris looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt. "I tried to stop it, Tam Fan, but they're everywhere. The network goes all the way to the top. There are people in the department, people who should have been protecting us, actively working to cover this up. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't." His voice faltered, and Lorraine could see the weight of his years of silence pressing down on him. She leaned forward, her voice low but filled with urgency. "I know you're scared, Morris, but you're not alone anymore. I'm here now, and we need the truth." He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd walked in, he seemed to gather some resolve. "It's all connected. Harris, Wilson, the others, they were just the tip of the iceberg. The real power is higher up. The police chief, some of the judges. I don't know who all of them are, but I can tell you this. It goes all the way to the mayor's office." Lorraine's stomach dropped. The mayor. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. This wasn't just a battle against a few bad officers. This was a systemic issue that had its roots buried in the heart of the city's power. "Can you prove it?" Lorraine asked, her voice steady but her mind racing. Morris nodded, his eyes intense now. "I've got files, documents, names, evidence of illegal activities, money laundering, embezzlement, all of it. But I can't just hand it over. I need protection. If I go public with this, I'm dead." "I can protect you," Lorraine said, her voice firm with resolve. "We'll get this to the right people. You'll be safe. You have my word." Morris swallowed hard, clearly struggling with the weight of what he was about to do. "If I'm going down, I'm not going down alone. This is bigger than me, bigger than you, Lorraine. We need to take them all down, or it'll keep happening." Lorraine leaned back in her chair, absorbing his words. They were getting closer to the truth, but she knew this was just the beginning. If they moved too fast, too soon, they would risk losing everything. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. "All right," Lorraine said, her voice low but filled with purpose. "We'll do this right. I'll get the documents. I'll make sure the media sees it. But we move carefully. No mistakes." Morris nodded, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his decision was finally sinking in. "I'll get you the files, but you need to act fast. They know we're onto them." The next few days were a blur of preparation and strategy. Lorraine's legal team worked around the clock, poring over the documents Morris had provided. The evidence was damning, clear links between Harris, Wilson, and other key players in the network. But even as they prepared to go public, Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Everywhere she went, there were eyes on her, on Maya, on the family. The media circus had only gotten bigger, and with it came the danger. The higher-ups knew they were close to being exposed, and they weren't going to let it happen without a fight. It wasn't long before Lorraine received the call. "Tam Fan," the voice on the other end said, sounding strained. "We've got a problem. Morris has disappeared. We don't know where he is." Lorraine's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "He's gone. No one can find him. He didn't show up for his last meeting. The whole team's looking for him, but there's no trace." "Get me a team," Lorraine snapped, her mind already racing. "We can't afford to lose him now." But deep down, Lorraine knew that this was just the beginning. Morris had been the key to everything, and now he was gone. The shockwave that had begun with the rally, with the truth coming to light, was reaching its peak. The system would fight back, and this time, the battle would be unlike anything they had faced before. Lorraine's phone rang just after midnight. She had barely fallen asleep after the endless meetings, the threats, and the mounting pressure of the case. But now the call snapped her awake. Her breath caught in her throat when she recognized the number. It was Detective Adams. "Tam Fan, you need to listen carefully." His voice was low, urgent, and unmistakably tense. "They're coming for you. You need to get out of there. Now." The words hit Lorraine like a physical blow. "What do you mean? What's happening?" I've just learned that your office was compromised. They've got eyes everywhere, inside the department, inside your team. We don't have much time. I've arranged for a safe place for you to go, but you need to leave now. They know everything." A cold sweat broke out across Lorraine's forehead as the gravity of the situation set in. She could feel the weight of everything, her family, the case, Maya, crumbling under the pressure of forces far more powerful than she had ever anticipated. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Lorraine said, her voice resolute, but her hands were trembling as she hung up the phone. Maya sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup in front of her. She hadn't seen her mother for hours. It was always like this now. Constant phone calls, meetings, strategy sessions. The noise of the world outside felt so distant compared to the quiet inside their house. But Maya knew better than anyone that things had changed. They weren't safe anymore. The door slammed open and Lorraine entered, her face pale but determined. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Her mother's expression was one she'd never seen before. There was something urgent, something frantic about her movements. "Maya." Lorraine's voice was low, but there was an edge to it. "Pack a bag. We're leaving. Now." Maya stood up, panic rising in her chest. "Mom, what's going on?" "There's no time to explain," Lorraine said quickly, grabbing a bag from the closet. "Just pack, sweetheart. We're going to get out of here before they realize we know." Maya felt a lump form in her throat as she rushed to grab a few clothes and her essentials. What was happening? Who was they? What had her mother learned? "Maya, listen to me," Lorraine's voice broke through her thoughts. "I need you to stay calm, okay? I'm doing this to keep you safe. This fight isn't over. We'll be back, I promise. But right now, we need to disappear for a while." Maya nodded, her hands trembling as she stuffed clothes into the bag. Her mind was racing. The case, the corruption, the protests, it had all led to this. She had never felt more uncertain, more afraid than she did in that moment. The car ride felt like it took forever. Lorraine's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. She could feel the eyes of the world on her. The shockwave from their actions was now rippling through the city, and the people behind the corruption were not going to stop until they silenced her family. As they drove, Lorraine's mind kept returning to the fact that Morris was still missing. They had no idea where he had gone, but Lorraine couldn't help but feel that his disappearance was connected to everything that was happening. Whoever had orchestrated this, whoever was in control of the corruption, they were smart. They had anticipated every move. And now, it felt like they were one step ahead. As they neared the outskirts of town, Lorraine's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, the name on the screen making her stomach tighten. It was Claire. "Lorraine, it's happening," Claire's voice came through urgently. "The media's gotten wind of the leak. They know we're onto them. The police chief is being implicated. Your name's coming up next." Lorraine's heart sank, but she tried to steady her breath. "What's happening, Claire?" "They've started digging into your family, Lorraine. They're making you the target. The investigation's gone public, and the media's turning this into a witch hunt. They're saying you're complicit in the cover-up. They're going to come after you." Lorraine's hands shook, but she pressed on the accelerator. The distance between them and the chaos of the city was widening, but it felt like the storm was catching up with them. "We can't afford to let them control the narrative," Lorraine said, her voice hard. "Get the story out there. Let them know they can't silence me." "We're doing everything we can," Claire said, "but it's going to be a fight. The mayor's office is involved. It's a tangled web, Lorraine. You have to stay hidden for now." By the time they reached the safe house, Lorraine's nerves were on edge. Every passing car, every shadow felt like it could be someone coming for them. The tension in the air was palpable. Maya stepped out of the car, her heart still racing as she looked around at the small, nondescript house they had arrived at. It was isolated, tucked away from the world, and for the first time in her life she understood what it meant to live in fear. "We'll be okay here," Lorraine said, trying to reassure both herself and Maya as she led her inside. "We'll keep fighting, I promise you." But even as she said it, Lorraine wasn't sure she believed it herself. The forces they were up against were far more powerful than she had ever imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. The fight for justice had become a fight for survival, and they couldn't afford to lose. As Lorraine locked the door behind them and drew the curtains, she knew they were in danger, but they weren't giving up. Not now, not ever. "We'll make it through this, Maya," Lorraine said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll make sure no one else ever has to suffer like you did." Maya nodded, the weight of her mother's words settling on her shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir within her. Hope. It wasn't over yet. They were just getting started. Lorraine sat at the small kitchen table, her hands trembling as she reviewed the latest intel. The room was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sigh from Maya, who was curled up on the couch, her face buried in her hands. She had never seen her daughter so broken, and the weight of the world felt like it was resting squarely on her shoulders. Everything they had worked for, the endless nights, the secrets, the risk, had brought them to this point. The fight for justice was no longer just about exposing the corrupt officers or dismantling the system. It was a fight for survival. If they lost now, it wouldn't just be their lives on the line. It would be the lives of countless others who had been silenced by the system that was supposed to protect them. Maya had been through so much, but Lorraine couldn't let her see how close they were to the edge. Not yet. She had to keep her focused, keep her moving forward. The phone buzzed, pulling Lorraine from her thoughts. She looked at the screen, and for the briefest moment, her heart skipped a beat. It was Claire. "Lorraine," Claire's voice was urgent, her tone tight with emotion. "We've got the documents. We're going public tomorrow. This is it. If we expose the full extent of the corruption, we'll bring down the entire network." Lorraine's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The final push, the moment that could either break them or give them everything they had been fighting for. "Are we ready?" Lorraine asked, her voice calm despite the pounding of her heart. "We're as ready as we'll ever be. The media's lined up. We've got witnesses. This is going to hit hard, Lorraine, but it's our only chance." Lorraine stood up from the table, pacing as she processed Claire's words. "I can't believe it's come to this. After everything, Maya's bravery, the protests, the rallies. This is the final piece. We'll finally expose the truth. I know, but once it's out there, we can't take it back. They'll come for us." A chill ran down Lorraine's spine. She knew what that meant. The forces behind the corruption weren't just people in power. They were the people who controlled everything. The ones who could make everything disappear if they wanted to. "But we can't stop now," Lorraine said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "We're doing this for Maya, for every person who's ever been mistreated, abused, forgotten by the system. We have to push forward, no matter what happens." The next morning, Lorraine, Maya, and their small team gathered in a room at a safe location. There were no windows here, no way to look out and see the chaos of the outside world. It felt like a fragile moment of peace, but Lorraine knew it wouldn't last. The calm before the storm. Maya sat in the corner, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of the chair. She had stayed up all night, and it was clear in the dark circles under her eyes that the weight of everything was catching up with her. Lorraine could see it. The fear in her daughter's eyes, the exhaustion in her face, but Maya was trying desperately to keep it together. "Are you okay?" Lorraine asked, her voice soft. Maya nodded, though Lorraine could tell it was a struggle. "Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready for what's coming. What if we're too late? What if it's not enough?" "Maya," Lorraine said firmly, walking over to her daughter. She knelt down so that their eyes were level. "You've been through so much already. You've shown everyone what true courage looks like, and I'm so proud of you. You're not alone in this. We've got each other." Maya looked at her mother, her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She didn't speak, but her silence said everything. They were in this together. "All right, we're ready." Claire's voice broke through the moment, and Lorraine stood up, turning to face her team. "It's time." The press conference was set. Reporters were gathered outside, cameras flashing, ready to hear what Lorraine had to say. The story had already begun to spread across social media. Rumors, leaks, whispers of the corruption at the heart of the police department and the higher-ups in the city's power structure. Lorraine had always been good at controlling the narrative in a courtroom, but this was different. This wasn't a trial. It was an all-out war for the truth. The public was watching, waiting to see what would happen. Would they believe her? Would they back her? Or would they let the story fade away, buried under a pile of lies? "We're in this for Maya," Lorraine whispered to herself before stepping into the spotlight. She walked to the podium, her heart pounding, but her mind sharp and clear. There was no turning back now. The cameras turned toward her, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. She cleared her throat and began. "Thank you all for being here. I stand before you today not just as a mother, but as a person who has been forced to watch the systems we trust fail the very people they were meant to protect. My daughter Maya was assaulted by a police officer. That is a fact. What many of you don't know is that this wasn't an isolated incident. What happened to Maya is part of a much larger pattern, a pattern of corruption that runs deep within our police department and our political system. The crowd murmured, the shock palpable in the air. Lorraine pressed on, her voice unwavering. We have evidence, evidence that links key members of our police force to criminal activity. We have proof of money laundering, drug trafficking, and systemic abuse of power. This is not just about Maya. This is about everyone who has been failed by the system. This is about taking back the power and ensuring that no one is above the law. The room was silent for a moment before the first question came. The cameras clicked frantically as reporters pushed forward, eager to get the next piece of the story. How do you plan to bring these officers to justice, given the corruption at the highest levels? A reporter asked. We are not stopping, Lorraine replied, her voice filled with conviction. We will continue to expose the truth, to fight for justice, and to make sure that no one else is ever hurt by this system again. This is just the beginning. The final push has started, and we're going to make sure that everyone who has been complicit in this is held accountable. Outside, the crowd cheered, the roar of their support filling the streets. The news was spreading like wildfire. But as Lorraine looked at Maya, standing beside her, she knew the battle was far from over. The fight for justice had only just begun. The day after the press conference, Lorraine felt a change in the air. The world had shifted. The truth about the corruption within the police department and the political establishment had been laid bare, and now there was no going back. The public outcry was deafening. Protesters filled the streets demanding justice for Maya and for every victim who had been silenced by the system. But the fight was far from over. Now came the hardest part, the reckoning. Lorraine sat in a small, nondescript office deep within the courthouse. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the sound of her own breath as she stared at the pile of papers in front of her. The evidence Morris had provided was overwhelming, but it was just a fragment of the larger web of corruption that had been woven through the system for years. She could feel the eyes of the city on her, waiting for the next move. But that was the problem. The reckoning wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about confronting the forces that would do anything to stop her. Her phone buzzed. Lorraine glanced at the screen. It was Claire. Lorraine, Claire's voice crackled through the line. Urgent. We've got a situation. What's going on? Lorraine's heart raced. The media's been all over your statement, but now they're circling. They've dug up a lot more. There are whispers of bigger names being involved. The mayor's office, some high-profile business figures. This isn't just about the cops anymore. Lorraine felt her chest tighten. The stakes were higher than she'd thought. What had started as a fight for her daughter's justice had quickly snowballed into a full-blown reckoning for the city, its leaders, and its hidden corruption. We've been through worse, Lorraine said, her voice steady. We won't back down, but we need to act fast. What's our next move? We push harder, Claire responded, the fire in her voice matching Lorraine's own. The media's hungry for more. We need to make sure we're controlling the narrative. We expose everything. Lorraine knew it was coming, the retaliation. She had felt it in her bones the moment the press conference had aired, but nothing could have prepared her for the first wave of attacks. It came through the front door of the courthouse, a sudden, urgent knock that shattered the quiet. Lorraine turned to find John Mitchell, her lead lawyer, standing in the doorway, his face pale, his hands shaking. Lorraine, we've got a problem. The judge overseeing the case, he's been compromised. We're losing ground. The evidence we thought we had, it's being blocked. Lorraine's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean blocked? The judge is refusing to hear critical testimony. Some of the evidence isn't being allowed in court. There's pressure from the top to keep this quiet. Lorraine stood up, fists clenched. The betrayal was closer than she had imagined. The court system, the people she had trusted for years, were now working against her. But this wasn't the time to back down. I'm not going to let them stop us, Lorraine said through gritted teeth. Get me the media. We'll go public with this. If they're trying to bury the truth in the courtroom, we'll take it to the streets. We need the people on our side. As Lorraine prepared to face the next wave of attacks, Maya sat in a room off to the side, her mind racing. The weight of the world was now squarely on her shoulders. She had seen her mother fight through the worst, but even Maya couldn't help but feel the growing uncertainty. Every move they made felt like a dangerous gamble. She wanted to help. She wanted to do something. But what could she do when the system they were up against seemed invincible? Her thoughts were interrupted when Lorraine walked in, her expression tired but resolute. Maya stood up instinctively, her heart in her throat. "Mom, what's happening?" Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lorraine smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "They're trying to silence us, Maya. They're doing everything they can to stop the truth from coming out, but we won't let them." Maya looked at her mother, seeing the determination in her eyes. It was in that moment that Maya knew. The fight wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been silenced, just like she had been. Her mother wasn't just fighting for her. She was fighting for every person who had ever been hurt by the system. And Maya wasn't going to let her mother do it alone. "I'm with you, Mom," Maya said, her voice clear, stronger now. "We're in this together." Lorraine pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, holding her close. "We've got each other, Maya, and we've got the truth. We're not going to stop until the world knows what happened." The media storm was unstoppable. News outlets across the country were picking up the story, and the pressure on the mayor's office was growing exponentially. It wasn't just the public now. The case had become a national scandal. The weight of the truth was too much for the system to ignore. It was only a matter of time before the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Lorraine sat in front of the camera for another press conference. This time her voice was calm, but the fire inside her burned brighter than ever. "They thought they could intimidate us into silence," Lorraine said, looking directly into the camera. "They thought that by hiding behind their power, they could suppress the truth. But we're not backing down. This is bigger than just one corrupt officer. This is about a system that's been broken for too long, and we're going to fix it." The media roared in response. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the energy in the room was electric. The reckoning had arrived, and Lorraine could feel the walls of the system shaking. The final push had begun. But as the lights of the cameras flashed, Lorraine knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice would continue, and the danger was far from over. But for the first time, she truly believed that they could win. The days that followed the public exposure of the corruption within the police department were chaotic. But in a way, they were also quieter than Lorraine had anticipated. The media was saturated with the story. The public outcry continued, but so did the backlash from those who had worked to protect the system. The city was in turmoil, and people were demanding accountability from those who had hidden behind power for far too long. But Lorraine could feel the shift, the change in the air, as if the world was watching, waiting to see if the promises made in the aftermath would be kept. The corrupt officers were under investigation, but no one was truly sure if the system would allow them to fall. Some days Lorraine felt the weight of it all, the fear, the anger, the uncertainty. But there was also something else: hope. Maya sat across from her at the kitchen table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the surface of her mug. The protests, the press conferences, the constant media presence, it was all a blur now. She hadn't had time to process what had happened, to truly understand the impact of it all. But she had been forced to grow up in a way she never expected. "Mom, do you think this is really going to work?" Maya's voice was soft, her eyes tired, and Lorraine could see the worry etched into her face. Lorraine set down her own cup, looking directly at her daughter. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we've done everything we can. We've told the truth. Now it's up to the system to decide what happens next." Maya nodded, her gaze distant. It feels like everything's changing so fast. I'm not sure if it's all real yet." "I understand," Lorraine said, her voice gentle but firm. "Everything's uncertain right now, but we can't let the uncertainty stop us from moving forward. We've made a difference. People are listening, and that's the most important thing." Meanwhile, the investigation into the corrupt officers continued. But Lorraine knew that things were not going to be easy. They were up against the very heart of the system, the police chief, key figures within the mayor's office, and a network that had operated under the surface for years. The fight was not just about one case, but about dismantling a corrupt structure that had abused its power for far too long. Detective Adams had been working tirelessly to gather more evidence, but with Morris still missing and the walls closing in on them, Lorraine had no illusions about the challenges ahead. "We've got the information," Adams said one evening, his voice low as they met in a safe location. "But there's more we need to uncover, more people involved, higher up, and every time we get close, someone's pulling strings to stop us." Lorraine nodded, her mind spinning with the weight of what he was saying. What's the next step? We need a breakthrough, Adam said, running a hand through his hair. And we need to make sure we've got a solid case. We've got witnesses willing to testify, but we can't afford to make any missteps. Lorraine leaned back, thinking about everything that had happened. She had known from the start that this wasn't going to be easy. They had fought for the truth, but truth was often buried by those who held the power. And the harder they pushed, the harder those in control fought back. The nights were the hardest. Lorraine would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house around her. She could hear Maya's soft breathing in the next room, and for a moment the world felt quiet. But then the doubt crept in, and she would think about everything that had been sacrificed. The fight for justice had cost them more than just peace of mind. It had put them in danger, and yet, Lorraine couldn't stop herself. She couldn't stop fighting, not when so many had been silenced, and not when Maya had been forced to live through something so unjust. And then one evening, the call came. It was from Claire. "Lorraine, we've got news," Claire said, her voice tinged with excitement and fear. "They've arrested one of the officers, Harris. He's being charged with corruption, abuse of power, and several other counts. It's happening." Lorraine's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The relief hit her like a wave, but so did the realization of what this meant. They had won a battle, but the war wasn't over. "What about the others?" Lorraine finally managed to ask. "They're still being investigated, but this is the breakthrough we needed. The floodgates are opening, Lorraine. They can't stop it now." The arrest of Officer Harris was a monumental moment, but it was only the beginning of the reckoning that had to follow. The press coverage was relentless, and the city was buzzing with a mixture of disbelief and hope. People who had lived under the oppressive power of the corrupt police force for years were finally starting to believe that change was possible. But for Lorraine and her family, the aftermath wasn't about the media attention or the headlines. It was about survival, about seeing this through to the end. The fight for justice was ongoing, and they had to remain vigilant. The arrest of one officer didn't change everything. It was just the first step toward a larger overhaul of the system. As Lorraine sat down with Maya that evening, she could see the exhaustion in her daughter's eyes. The world had been spinning for so long, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a moment of stillness. "We did it, Mom," Maya said quietly, the words barely a whisper. "We really did it." Lorraine smiled, though the weight of the battle ahead still loomed large in her mind. "We've made a difference, Maya, but we're not done yet. We'll keep pushing until this is over." Maya nodded, the strength of her mother's words settling into her heart. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a belief that they could change the world, piece by piece. The reckoning had begun, but it wasn't over yet. The arrest of Officer Harris had sent shockwaves through the city, but the aftermath was far from the closure Lorraine had hoped for. The case had cracked open a massive can of worms, but the real battle was just beginning. As much as the public rejoiced in the small victories, charges filed, corrupt officials under investigation, Lorraine knew the hardest part was ahead. It was easy to celebrate a victory in the moment, but real change would require a sustained effort, one that could be met with resistance at every turn. Sitting in a dimly lit room with the faint buzz of the television in the background, Lorraine looked over the latest headlines. She should have felt relief, but all she felt was the weight of the road ahead. The arrest was one small step, but the path to systemic change was far longer and more treacherous than she had ever imagined. Maya, who had remained mostly silent in the days following the arrest, came into the room. She didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, observing her mother as she sat hunched over a stack of legal documents. For a moment, Maya just watched her, taking in the exhaustion in her mother's eyes. She had seen that look before, the look that said there was still so much more to do and not enough time to do it. "Mom?" Maya's voice broke the silence, soft but full of concern. Lorraine looked up, her expression softening when she saw her daughter standing there. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" "I don't know," Maya replied, moving to sit across from her mother. "It just feels different now. Like the fight's not over, but I don't know what we're supposed to do next." Lorraine sighed, rubbing her eyes. She was tired. Tired of the constant grind. Tired of fighting a system that refused to change. But Maya was right. They had taken a big step, but there was so much more left to do. "The next step," Lorraine said slowly, "is about making sure the fight doesn't stop here. We've exposed the corruption, but that's only the beginning. We need to ensure that the people who have been complicit in this aren't able to sweep it under the rug. We have to hold them accountable, not just Harris, but everyone who has been part of this system. Maya nodded, her brow furrowed as she processed her mother's words. But how? How do we make sure that happens? How do we keep this momentum going? Lorraine leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. We take this to the next level. We keep pushing. We work with the activists, the media, the community leaders. We need to mobilize. People need to see that this isn't just about one officer. It's about a corrupt system that's been operating under our noses for far too long. Maya stared at her, taking in her mother's words. There was something different about Lorraine now. The exhaustion, the fear, it was still there, but it had been replaced by a new fire. The fight was far from over, but Lorraine was ready to push forward. She had no choice. "I'm with you, Mom," Maya said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Whatever it takes." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and strategy sessions. The arrest of Officer Harris was just the first domino to fall, but the rest of the pieces were slow to move. Every step forward was met with resistance from powerful people, people who wanted to protect their secrets at all costs. Lorraine knew that they had to keep their momentum, but she also understood that the system wasn't going to crumble easily. She had been in the fight for so long that she knew exactly how deep the roots of corruption ran. But there was something else, something that kept her going. The people. The people who were demanding change. The people who had been silenced for far too long. They were the ones who would ensure that the reckoning didn't end with one arrest. They were the ones who would push for the new path. One evening, Lorraine sat down with her team, Detective Adams, Claire, and John Mitchell, to discuss the next steps. They had gathered all the evidence they could, but the corruption ran so deep that it was hard to know who they could trust. "It's going to take more than just public pressure," John said, his voice tight with frustration. "We need concrete proof. We need to go after the people at the top, the mayor's office, the police chief. If we don't expose them, all of this will be for nothing." Lorraine nodded, her eyes narrowed in determination. "I agree, but we have to be careful. We've already made enemies in high places, and we can't afford to make any mistakes now. We're walking a fine line." Claire leaned forward, her voice firm. "The public's on our side, Lorraine. The more we push, the more people will rally to our cause. But we need to be strategic. We need to keep the pressure up and keep our focus on the bigger picture. This is about more than just one case. It's about changing the system." Detective Adams, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, spoke up. "I've got a contact inside who can help us with the next step, but we have to move fast. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." Lorraine looked at each of them, feeling a surge of hope. It had been a long, difficult road, but she wasn't alone. She had her team. She had her daughter. And together, they would make sure that the truth came to light. "We're ready," Lorraine said, her voice calm but filled with determination. "We fought too hard to back down now. Let's finish this." The next few weeks were a blur of action. Evidence was leaked to the press, insiders came forward, and the people rallied behind them. The momentum was unstoppable, and the walls of the corrupt system began to crack. Every step forward was met with more resistance, but Lorraine's resolve never wavered. She knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult battle. As she stood in front of a crowd of thousands, speaking out against the very system that had wronged her and her family, Lorraine felt a sense of clarity. The fight had taken its toll on her, but it had also shown her something else, a new path, one where justice wasn't just a hope, but a real possibility. And this time, they weren't stopping. Not now. Not ever. The sun was rising over the city, but the morning light felt different this time. After weeks of turmoil, of battles fought in courtrooms and on the streets, Lorraine finally allowed herself a moment of peace. She sat in the living room of her house, Maya beside her, their fingers intertwined, each feeling the weight of everything they had been through. The city outside was still waking up, but for them, the dawn of this day marked something deeper. It wasn't just a new day. It was the beginning of a new path. The last few months had been a whirlwind. The revelations of police corruption had shaken the very foundation of the city, but now, in the aftermath, things were slowly starting to change. The corrupt officers had been arrested, and some were facing charges they could no longer escape. The investigations into the political figures who had aided and abetted the corruption were gaining momentum. But most importantly, the public had awoken. People had rallied behind Lorraine and Maya. demanding accountability. And for the first time in a long time, Lorraine felt as though the truth had won, even if the war wasn't yet over. Maya sat beside her, her expression softer now than it had been in days. The weight that had been crushing her seemed to lift just a little. The protests, the fear, the pain, it was all still there, but it felt less overwhelming now. They had been heard. They had made their stand. And though the future was still uncertain, there was a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. "Mom?" Maya's voice broke through Lorraine's thoughts. "Do you think it's really over?" Lorraine smiled gently, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I don't think it's ever truly over, but we've made a difference. A real one." Maya nodded, her eyes distant. "I'm just scared. What happens next? What if things go back to the way they were?" "I don't think they will," Lorraine said, her voice full of certainty. "We've started something here, Maya. This fight, this new beginning, it's bigger than us. We've shown people that they can stand up too, that they don't have to let the system control them anymore." Maya looked at her mother, studying her closely. "But Mom, we're not done, right?" Lorraine felt a pang in her chest. She had thought the same thing so many times, wondering if they had reached the end, if they could afford to take a breath. But she knew better. The fight for justice was far from over. The people behind the corruption, the ones pulling the strings, hiding in the shadows, were still out there, and their work was just beginning. "No," Lorraine said, her voice firm with a quiet resolve. "We're not done. We'll keep fighting until there's true change. But for now, we take a breath. We've earned it." The next few weeks brought both relief and new challenges. As the media continued to cover the arrests, the pressure on those in power grew. The mayor's office was under scrutiny, with multiple investigations into the financial ties between officials and the corrupt officers. But even with the winds of change beginning to blow, Lorraine knew that the road ahead would be full of hurdles. They were not just up against individuals, but against a system that had been entrenched for decades. It would take more than a few arrests to dismantle it. Lorraine worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meeting with activists, community leaders, and legal experts to ensure the momentum continued. She knew that the public had given them the strength to keep pushing, but now it was about making sure that power was used wisely. There was still so much work to be done. The fight for justice was never a simple path. It was a journey that would continue for as long as there was inequality, as long as there was a system designed to suppress the voices of the oppressed. Despite the challenges, Lorraine could feel the change. The people who had once been too scared to speak out were now standing tall. The protests were still happening, but they were different now. It wasn't just about one family, one case. It was about something larger, something bigger than any single person. One afternoon, as Lorraine walked through the city streets, her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Tam Fan Johnson." Lorraine turned to see a group of protesters approaching, their faces bright with hope and energy. It was a small group, no more than a dozen people, but their presence felt powerful. The signs they held were painted with messages of hope, of justice, and of solidarity. For a moment, Lorraine stood still, taking in the sight. "We just wanted to thank you," one of the young women said, her eyes shining with determination, "for standing up for us, for showing us that we can make a difference." Lorraine's heart swelled with pride. "No," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "This is not just about me. This is about all of you, all of us. We fought together, and now we'll keep fighting until change comes." The group cheered, their energy contagious. Lorraine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had started something, a movement that could not be stopped. And even if the journey ahead was long, she knew that the new path they had forged would carry them forward. Back at home that evening, Lorraine sat beside Maya, both of them silent for a moment. The room was peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the past months. But for the first time in a long time, Lorraine allowed herself to believe that they were on the right path. "I think we're going to be okay," Maya said, breaking the silence. Lorraine smiled softly, looking at her daughter. "We will be, together." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a new beginning, one that would shape their lives and the lives of those around them. The fight for justice was far from over, but Lorraine felt a quiet confidence now. They had come so far, and the path ahead, though uncertain, was one they would walk together.